I am very happy to be here, and in fact the timing was incredibly fortuitous because for the last few years I have been working on a story that when I first broached the idea, everybody looked at me like skeptically, even the trusted people around me who have been through a lot with me, and that was a story about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan today. It was funny because nobody thought that that was an issue to be paying any attention to, and nobody thought there was any real traction to that. And it pissed me off because I knew I wasn't wrong. I had covered that war from the beginning, and I had watched what was happening on the battlefield, and I had never missed a year of the Afghan war. I've been back every single year. Sometimes I stayed for a year and didn't come home, you know, and I knew that we were being lied to, and I knew that the American people were being misled. And when it comes to issues that I care about, like issues of national security, I don't think that politics should dictate your national security policy. And I don't know a journalist that likes being lied to. So that combination really set us on this path. That and the fact that the challenge of covering a war year after year after year is that how do I at 60 Minutes, I don't live on the ground in Kabul, Afghanistan anymore. I don't have the benefit of that time there and being able to develop stories and break news. So what contribution can I make from afar? And that's when you look at the situation in Afghanistan, you look at the battlefield and you think, what's the smartest story that I can do? Because what's the story that tells people something that really matters? There's 100,000 things you can say about Afghanistan and about the war that are all interesting and relevant and important. But there's only one of two of them that dictate what it means and where it's taking us and what the consequences are of what we're doing there. And that's the way that I try to find my stories. And that led us into this investigation of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And I want to show you just a short clip from the piece that ran on Sunday night so that you can have some sense of what I talk about as I move forward. The war in Afghanistan is now the longest war in American history. 11 years after 9/11, the enemy the U.S. went there to defeat is coming back, according to the two men who know more about this than anyone, U.S. General John Allen and Afghan President Hamid Karzai. We interviewed both of them, and they were blunt about where the war stands and about an enemy tactic that's killing more and more Americans. We arrived in the Afghan capital just after 4 U.S. soldiers were gunned down by an Afghan policeman who was with them in a firefight. It's what the U.S. military calls an insider attack, when U.S. forces are killed by the Afghans they're training and fighting with. Last month, these attacks were the leading killer of American troops. It's a critical problem for General Allen, whose job is to make sure Afghan security forces take over the fight, so U.S. soldiers can come home. You're in a tough spot right now. Can you explain why the sudden increase in these attacks?
Well, I'm mad as hell about them, to be honest with you. We're going to get after this. It reverberates everywhere across the United States. You know, we're willing to sacrifice a lot for this campaign, but we're not willing to be murdered for it.
At a certain point, if these attacks continue, American people are going to say, we've had enough, right? Why are we training these people if they're murdering us?
Well, that may be, in fact. It may be the voice right now that we're hearing. The key point is for us to understand that the vast majority of the Afghans, and you've lived with them, you understand these people, they're with us in this. They understand right now the severity of this problem and the urgency of what's happening. And there have been Afghans who've been killed trying to save our forces when these attacks have been underway, because that was the only reaction that they could have taken, was to try to save us at the moment of that attack.
Training Afghan troops like these Afghan Special Forces soldiers is the centerpiece of General Allen's mission.
Once they're there, we're going to move.
He's already had to suspend training twice because of the rise in insider attacks, which are threatening America's exit strategy.
Should Americans brace themselves for more attacks? Is this going to continue?
It will. The enemy recognizes this as a vulnerability. You know, in Iraq, the signature weapon system that we hadn't seen before was the IED. We had to adjust to that. Here, I think the signature attack that we're beginning to see is going to be the insider attack.
General Allen has asked Afghanistan's President Hamid Karzai to do something to keep enemy elements out of the Afghan army and police.
These attacks are sad. And this is something that I've discussed in detail, something that I bear responsibility for to correct.
We met President Karzai at the presidential palace in Kabul, where he spends most of his time. He rarely ventures beyond these manicured grounds and fortress walls that have housed Afghanistan's leaders for more than 100 years. And with good reason. He survived 4 serious assassination attempts, like this one in southern Afghanistan in 2002, when U.S. Navy SEALs guarding him gunned down his attacker. Now, as his forces take over security, they still face a formidable enemy.
Can you tell Americans what's still at stake in Afghanistan after all these years of war?
The reason for the NATO and American intervention in Afghanistan was terrorism. Terrorism has not gone away. It has increased.
When you say that terrorism has increased, what do you mean exactly?
If terrorism means violence against civilians, if terrorism means violence against our allies, it has increased. It has not abated. It has not gone away.
President Karzai says Afghan intelligence reports to him on the presence of foreign fighters, Arabs, Chechens, and others, who are captured and killed on Afghan soil.
Name them Al-Qaeda, name them Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, name them Haqqani, name them Taliban, whatever. They're still there, and they have the ability to continue 10 years on to come and hurt us and kill your troops and kill our troops, kill our civilians. We must then question how come they've returned.
Well, that's a good question. How come?
How come they've returned?
How did that happen?
Something must have gone wrong for that to happen.
One place where things have gone wrong is in the mountains of Kunar in the east of the country, which has become Al-Qaeda's base of operations in Afghanistan today. These are enemy fighters and leaders, filmed there by our Afghan cameraman, who visited a number of different enemy camps. We couldn't go ourselves because it's too dangerous for Westerners to travel on their own to Kunar. They told our cameraman that they work side by side with Al-Qaeda and share their ideology. One Taliban commander agreed to meet with us in the Afghan capital. He's a specialist in suicide bombings, trained by Al-Qaeda. The safest place we could find was the back of a car, and he would only talk if we concealed his identity. As we made our way through the streets, we had to avoid the city's heavy security and keep our cameras hidden from view. Who's behind the insider attacks, what the Americans call insider attacks, infiltrating the Afghan police and army? Is that you?
These are Taliban attacks. This is part of our new military strategy. We have our people in the Afghan police and the army, and the orders come from the top. He told us Al-Qaeda fighters are rushing to Afghanistan, and that he has more than a dozen of them under his command. He also said they've been the driving force that has made the Taliban more lethal on the battlefield. Are you the only commander with Al-Qaeda fighters? There are many groups that have them. We can't do this without them.
What skills do the Al-Qaeda fighters bring?
They are masters of everything. For example, making IEDs, something we don't know how to do. But they are teaching us. They're also master engineers and good with all weapons. When our weapons break, they are the ones who repair them. We can't do this without them.
While the U.S. has been saying for a long time that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is almost defeated, the U.S. military's own reports from the battlefield reveal a very different picture. They're rich with detail about Al-Qaeda's leaders and operations today, confirming the existence of Al-Qaeda training camps and multiple attack cells. Among those they say they've killed are Al-Qaeda weapons and explosives experts. In 1 month, The U.S. says it killed more than 25 Al-Qaeda leaders and fighters.
Al-Qaeda has come back. Al-Qaeda is a resilient organization, but they're not here in large numbers. But Al-Qaeda doesn't have to be anywhere in large numbers.
Right, the numbers are not significant.
No, they're
right?
not. They're not significant in a traditional military sense. Al-Qaeda has significance beyond its numbers, frankly. And so for us, our 24-hour-a-day objective is to seek out those Al-Qaeda cells, and as we seek them out, to target them and eliminate them. And we're doing that 24 hours a day. We do not want Al-Qaeda to feel as though it can put down roots here. That's the key.
A four-star general like Allen is expected to be as much a politician as a warrior. And one of his more sensitive tasks is dealing with the Afghan president, whose relationship with the U.S. has soured in recent years. We found the president frustrated with the ongoing bloodshed.
A lot of innocent people die every day. The question is, what have we done wrong that they're still able to continue to hurt and damage people? That is, for me, as the President of Afghanistan, the most important question. And that is the question that I've engaged with the United States almost daily.
And are you satisfied with the answers you get from them?
Never, no. Never. That's been one of our difficulties.
Not satisfied, Karzai told us, with the answers he's getting from General Allen.
I have letters from General Allen who says that the security in Afghanistan is a lot better and the people are waiting for improved governance.
Do you agree with him?
No, I don't agree with that.
You tell him that?
Yes, yes.
What does he
the
say?
security has improved, but not completely.
He doesn't agree with that. He says that's wrong. And he's told you he's not satisfied with the answers he's getting from you. What do you say to that?
Well, I think we have a difference of opinion on that. The security situation isn't perfect around the country. I mean, there are lots of areas that remain insecure, probably is the word. But an awful lot of the population of this country is living in an area where there is vastly improved security from where it was just a few years ago.
They did agree on a few things. Right now, there's no peace process at all with the Taliban. And Pakistan is the problem. Enemy fighters from the Afghan battlefield have enjoyed freedom and sanctuary on Pakistani soil since the beginning of the war.
Ultimately, it's not going to matter what you do if you do not address the critical element of the safe havens that the enemy has inside Pakistan, across the border, in many ways out of your reach.
Well, we're doing a great deal right now. The relationship that we have between ISAF forces and the Pakistani military has improved dramatically.
But it doesn't stop the Pakistanis helping our enemies kill U.S. soldiers.
Well, that's not going to stop immediately, and we've got to work at that. And it's not a solution that can be had ultimately by a military solution. These are policy issues. These are government-to-government issues. I'm not going to be able to wage war in Pakistan. But this is hard. There's a very complex relationship with Pakistan. And we'll work very hard, very closely with the Pakistani military to achieve common objectives. But to some extent, the Pakistani military has been successful in cooperating with us in the last several months with regard to complementary operations on both sides of the border, but much more needs to be done.
Your deadliest enemies on the Afghan battlefield have complete freedom of movement inside Pakistan, with the blessing of the Pakistanis. And every commander that sat in your shoes has had to try and build a relationship and go through the same motions time and time again. And the effect on the battlefield remains exactly the same. American soldiers continue to die because of the support Pakistan gives to America's enemies.
You just stated the truth.
That's got to make you mad.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And within the context of my authorities, we're going to do everything we can to hunt down and kill every one of those Haqqani operatives that we can inside this country. And those other elements that come out of those safe havens that ultimately threaten my troops, threaten the Afghan troops and the Afghan society, the Afghan civilians, and ultimately the Afghan government.
President Karzai blames the U.S. for not confronting Pakistan years ago.
Why has the U.S. failed to address the issue with Pakistan, do you think?
Perhaps politics.
What has been the cost of that?
Heavy for us. Disastrous for us.
Would Afghanistan look completely different today if the issue of sanctuary and safe haven in Pakistan had been dealt with years ago?
Absolutely. Completely different. much more peaceful, much more progressed, much more stable, and a society that would have been thriving on its own.
Does that make you angry?
Absolutely, very much. And we have shown it.
Was there much yelling and screaming behind closed doors?
Plenty of that.
Listening to you, I get the feeling that there's a lot of anger towards the United States. There's been bad blood. What went wrong? Why do you feel this way?
I don't feel angry. Afghanistan feels let down.
President Karzai has repeatedly expressed his gratitude for the sacrifices the U.S. has made in his country. But in recent years, he's been outspoken and critical of his American partners.
When Americans hear you criticize the U.S., they think of all the taxpayer money that they have sent to Afghanistan and the American lives that have been lost here. And some question what kind of partner you have been.
So our criticism is not directed at the American people. Our criticism is directed at policies and behavior of those who are representing the United States people, and is in a manner of asking for change and improvement.
General Allen knows that America's combat mission in Afghanistan is drawing to a close. He told us he expects they'll be fighting to the last day of this military campaign, which began with 9/11 and will end, the White House says, 27 months from now.
How do you feel about having a political timetable for your military campaign?
Well, it focuses us pretty good. I walk home at night after a day here, and with 27 months on the clock, I ask myself every night whether I've done enough. And some nights I turn around and go back.
I get the feeling, sitting here talking to you, listening to you, that this is not just a job. It's not about the next promotion. You're carrying this campaign in your heart. This matters.
Yes, I am. I came here believing this would be the last job I'd ever have. I don't care about anything beyond this. This is what's important to me. I almost can't remember ever having been anywhere else. This is completely consuming for me. And I'm dedicated 24 hours a day to these magnificent troops, to the Afghans, to this cause, and ultimately to successful completion. This is very personal to me, and I take it very personally.
Go to 60minutesovertime.com to hear Lara Logan discuss what it's like to be face-to-face with the enemy.
So why did that story matter, and why did we choose to do that particular story? Well, for a number of reasons, but particularly because if Al-Qaeda was truly what drew us to Afghanistan after 9/11, then it was we felt it was a fair and legitimate question to be asking of American leaders. What is the state of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? And you would have heard bandied around the number 50 all the time. The head of the CIA, other people, officials in the administration, love to tell us today that there are only 50 Al-Qaeda left in Afghanistan, and the impression that we're given is that they're one drone strike away from obliteration. And that's just simply not true. They know it's not true. And what we had to do was to set about investigating it to discover what was the truth. And we had to be very careful about that, because there is a distinction between investigating something to find out what the real situation is and trying to prove something that you believe is true. And those are two very different things, and the second one is a very dangerous thing. And it's the enemy of great journalism. And it's a trap that it's very easy to fall into. And in fact, it was my boss, Jeff, who kindly reminded me of that at a certain point in the process here. And as usual, he was absolutely right. And we didn't need to prove anything because it was so evident. So how did we set about doing that? Well, of course, we turned to the official record, and that meant reading, and researching everything that anyone in the administration or a position of authority had to say about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan over the last few years. Fortunately, I read just about everything on a daily basis, so I stay on top of a lot of that, and that is not hard. I think having areas, having beat reporters exist for a reason, right? I mean, beat reporting is a great thing, because there's nothing like that institutional knowledge and that depth of knowledge over time, and that gut feeling that you have that tells you when someone's full of shit and when they're not, and what you should be concentrating on and what you shouldn't, to guide you in doing real, true investigative work. And so we not only had to look into all of that, but we had to look at every counterterrorism expert in the field. We went to the agencies, you know, obviously to the CIA, to wherever we could go. We went to the think tanks. We went to anyone who could possibly know about this. And we kept hearing the same thing time and time again, is that, you know, there's no political reason for anybody to be talking to you about this right now, because if we talk about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, doesn't that undermine the argument for leaving? And that was really a problem for us. At one point, we even had in writing from the US military that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was off the table, that they weren't even prepared to talk about that, which only made us more determined to talk about it, because when you're constantly knocked down, when people constantly try to bury you, and you have the sense that you're onto something, you know that it's worthwhile. It's hard not to doubt yourself, and you know that at the end of the day you're going to be standing alone on the 50-yard line in the Super Bowl, right? I mean, you're on the premiere of 60 Minutes, and you're saying something that nobody in the administration wants to hear. And a lot of people in the United States military don't want out there, because there were a lot of people who weren't helpful to us in the pursuit of this story. So you better not overstate it. You better know that what you're doing is correct, and you better not screw it up. And you know, the official American position is only one part of that. Just as important to us was what Al-Qaeda themselves had to say about this. There's been a narrative coming out of Washington over the last few years, many of it driven by Pakistani lobbying money and by Taliban apologists. One of my favorite things to read about is how the Taliban today is so unlike the Taliban of 2001. They're just a more moderate, gentler, kinder Taliban who just can't wait to see women in the workplace occupying, you know, an equal role in society, and, you know, great economic prosperity for all of Afghanistan, and don't really want to take us back 3,000 years into that terrible, terrible place that I witnessed in 2001 when I went with the Afghan soldiers who retook Kabul from the Taliban. You know, it's such nonsense. And every now and then you'll read someone in a British paper or someone in an American paper, someone saying to you that they've been talking to the Taliban, and Taliban wanted to go to peace talks, and they you know, they're ready to renounce their links with Al-Qaeda. There's really the theory is, if you pack up and go home from Afghanistan, the problem is over. The Taliban just want their country back. They've got no problem with you, and we can stop wasting billions of dollars and American lives in Afghanistan, and we can turn our backs on this war that has really been a waste of our time. That's amazing to me that that's where we are today. Because, I mean, not only do I remember the promises that were made, which is fine, you don't want to keep your promises, that's politics, I guess. But to think that there's any similarity between this and Vietnam is ridiculous. The Viet Cong didn't care what you did when you went back to America. The Viet Cong weren't fighting for an Islamic caliphate. The Viet Cong didn't have a global struggle. And it's amazing to me that we constantly ignore what Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and Haqqani and all these groups tell us every day in their own newspapers and their own statements. They share something. They share an idea. Al-Qaeda is not an organization. You don't have to have a card, a membership card or a badge or something that we recognize in our society, something that the FBI can say, okay, I know what that is. I'm going to hold you responsible for what you did in Libya, and we're going to put you on trial in America. This is terrorism. It's a completely and utterly different fight from anything we have faced in our history. And that's why we chose to do this story. Because what's the one thing about Afghanistan that's going to come home to haunt us? What we have done there for the last 11 years, our role in the Middle East, our role across the world, our way of life is under attack. And if you think that's government propaganda, if you think that's nonsense, if you think that's warmongering, you're not listening to what the people who are fighting you say about this fight. In your arrogance, you think you write the script, but you don't. There's two sides, and we don't dictate the terms. In fact, after 11 years of a war in Afghanistan, where we're surrendering, rushing for the exits as fast as we can, not only do we not dictate the terms, but we have less power to dictate anything on the world stage. And we now face an enemy, that former U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, whose interview didn't make this piece, but we did talk to him, and he said, we've killed all the slow and stupid ones. The ones that are left are more committed, and they didn't become any kinder or gentler in the last 11 years. And he's absolutely right. Another thing Ryan Crocker said was, we think we've won the campaign when they haven't even begun to fight. And that's right. So as a reporter doing investigative work, I chose this subject because, one, I can't stand that there's a major lie being propagated about the real situation. I don't care who's in power. I don't care who's behind it. I'm looking only at, like I said to General Allen, you can sit here and tell me that you're building a relationship with the Pakistanis. Let me see. General McNeil, the first commanding general in Afghanistan, told me that. So did his replacement, General Barno. General Eikenberry chose not to discuss it and walked out before the interview. General McNeil told me that again after his second term in Afghanistan, before he retired. General Schlosser, when he was there, and General Allen, who was so remarkably frank and passionate in his interview that I went there. You know, he was kind of like the invisible general. People don't know a lot about General Allen. But I walked away from that interview thinking, if my son was in the United States military in Afghanistan, I would probably want him to have a leader like that, because he had the courage of his convictions. And what you didn't see in that story is him at the end saying, where I said to him, I get the feeling, General, this is personal to you. And he said, I didn't come here. I came here fully expecting this would be the last job that I ever did. This is completely consuming. I almost can't remember ever having been anywhere else. And what's amazing to me is we ask that of people, and we send them to war, and we send people to die. And if anyone wants to know what your tax dollars also pay for, because we were talking about tax dollars earlier, go and visit Walter Reed sometime, or Bethesda National Medical Center, as it's called, or take your family to Arlington Cemetery and see the fresh graves that have been dug, those soldiers haven't been put in the ground by Hamas and other people on the terrorist list. They've been put there by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and Haqqani and the Pakistani government and all those people who want to destroy the United States, the West, and our way of life. So we tried very hard with this story to get to the places that are difficult to get to. Al-Qaeda changed the nature of journalism forever when they slit Daniel Pearl's throat on camera. They changed our currency. Journalists no longer had a value in reporting things and being witnesses. They became participants in the conflict and in the fight. If Osama bin Laden wanted to get his message out, he didn't need to sit down with 60 Minutes. He had any number of jihadi forums, his Al-Sahab, his own magazine, and Arabic news channels to send his tapes to. And when you go into a situation like the one I was with that Taliban commander, you always got to think, what's his motivation for talking to me? Because that, in the end, is really going to be the thing that determines whether I walk away from that meeting or I don't, right? Because there's obviously a certain amount of risk involved in all of these decisions, but at the end of the day, if you really believe that someone is there for the reasons they say they are, then you've got a chance of coming away from it alive. And in fact, that particular commander I had met before, back in 2006 when he was a fighter, and I went and embedded with the Taliban in Ghazni, just south of Kabul. Less than a mile from a US base, I was with like 300 Taliban fighters back in 2006, before we even admitted that the insurgency was back. And I say insurgency like that because the Taliban was a government in power, and they're fighting to get back in power. They don't see themselves as insurgents. It's a very important distinction. And for me, if you fail to identify the ideological component to this fight, if you fail to identify what your enemy is really fighting for, if you lie about who they really are, I don't see how you can possibly have the right strategy. And what we wanted to do was to leave people with a sense of something that mattered, something that is going to resonate, something that I honestly believe will come back to haunt us. As it did before, it's almost like Groundhog Day in Afghanistan. That, you know, just as Charlie Wilson's war, right? Charlie Wilson said, you know, if you turn your back on Afghanistan now, you're going to pay a price. And we didn't believe them. And then there was 9/11. And when I look at what's happening in Libya, there's a big song and dance about whether this was a terrorist attack or a protest. And you just want to scream, for God's sake. Are you kidding me? The last time we were attacked like this was the USS Cole, which was a prelude to the 1998 embassy bombings, which was a prelude to 9/11. And you're sending in FBI to investigate. I hope to God that you're sending in your best clandestine warriors who are going to exact revenge and let the world know that the United States will not be attacked on its own soil, that its ambassadors will not be murdered, and the United States will not stand by and do nothing about it.
Story this week on Afghanistan, when a Taliban commander, our enemy, gets into your car and sits next to you.
Salam alaikum. It took months of negotiations. You don't just walk in and say, oh, I want to do this.
Was that nerve-wracking?
You know, it was nerve-wracking. It's not a game. This is a guy who is trained by Al-Qaeda and is a specialist in suicide bombing. So I don't know if he means what he says when he agrees to talk to us. I don't know if he's made some arrangement with somebody to carjack our car and hand me over to Al-Qaeda. I mean, you really don't know.
This wasn't the first time that you met this commander.
Well, the last time I met him was in 2006, when he was a fighter and not a commander. Do you remember me? Yeah?
I remember you. Yeah, come after at evening time at Gabaru village.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't miss the opportunity to remind me that he'd saved my life in 2006. That's really what the point of that conversation was. And I got the message loud and clear. He was right, he did. We had traveled to an area just south of the Afghan capital to meet with these Taliban commanders and fighters. And when we left in the middle of the night, in the dark, you know, it was dark, pitch dark. And we suddenly found ourselves completely lost in a minefield with no idea of which way to turn. We'd actually driven over one of their mines. And we were lucky enough that we hadn't detonated it. And he put his foot on the spot where the mine was actually laying. It was one of his mines that he'd laid, and he knew exactly where it was. And we had to then maneuver around it.
That was his mine that he had put in the ground?
Oh, yeah, that's what was going on. And so, of course, that was one of the first things that he said to me when I got in the car. I'm the one that had my foot on the mine. Yeah, watch the truck. Tell Richard the truck behind him.
Where are you?
In Kabul, in the Afghan capital. See the big truck behind Richard?
No.
That truck has stayed with us from the traffic. And the driver and the passenger both looked at me. I think they're...
And you're basically just driving in circles, trying to avoid police or...
Yes, trying to avoid police, trying to avoid army, trying to get through checkpoints. And there were a number of times we had to stop. Your heart's in your mouth. Police. Coming past. They're coming past.
What did you do, pull the camera down and cover it?
We pulled the camera down and covered it. I had a scarf on, you know, and tried to sort of look down, not make eye contact.
I noticed a couple of moments in that interview when you were sort of pulling your sleeves and checking.
I know, I suddenly realized when I got in the car with this guy that my shirt had 3/4 sleeves. You know, because you're dealing with people who don't believe that women should show their faces in public. And then he looks out the window. And he sees 2 Afghan women. They've both got headscarves on. They've got, you know, long flowing robes. It's not like they're wearing tight fitting clothing or anything. But they don't have the traditional Afghan burqa, which are those, you know, the blue traditional robes where the whole face is covered and there's just those tiny little holes they're peeking through. And his whole demeanor changes. But they're covered from head to toe except the face. What does he want? You know, and he's just a different person instantly in that one moment. And he's clearly disgusted. Oh yeah, he's angry, he's disgusted, he's offended. It comes from deep within him. You can just kind of tell. And he's like, look at this. This is disgusting. This is wrong. And I'm going to have to pay for my sins for looking on these women's uncovered faces. And he says, and you.
I'm going to pay for my sins for looking on your uncovered face too.
So if he looks at me, he's going to have sins?
What do you think he was up to? Why do you think he agreed to sit and tell you those things that day?
He struck me as someone who, I wouldn't say they want to be understood. You want your side of history to be recorded, right? You want your role in that. And you don't want that history to be written purely by the other side. You want to have a hand in writing it yourself if it's your own history.
I thought it was interesting how he didn't hesitate to tell you that his goal is to destroy America.
It's always difficult when you talk to someone like that who's involved in killing Americans. There's always a conflict within you. And you know there are some people who are going to say, how could they do that? You know, how could they give a voice to these guys? We're not there for superficial reasons. We're there for very serious reasons. We're trying to understand what this war has done, what it means, where it's going, trying to understand things that are relevant to the national security of the United States, that determine my future, my children's future. And we take these responsibilities very, very seriously. We don't do this lightly. We don't go and get in a car with a guy like that lightly. It's not for TV.